into the 21st century, sir. I commend this bill.
Dr. Rajan Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on this bill. And clearly, Mr. Speaker, it's this type of bill that demonstrates the difference between the philosophical positions of this side of the House and of that side of the House. Before I get into that, Mr. Speaker, I mean, it is clear we are supporting the bill to demonstrate that Labour is not in the business of supporting those who defraud our system. And so for that reason, we are supporting the bill. But in supporting that, there is every need to demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, the basic difference between the way this side of the House looks at those who are vulnerable and those who are poor and those who are forced into a stage of their lives where they are dependent on welfare to be treated fairly. And I think there's nothing demonstrate that difference, Mr. Speaker, more clearly than the language that has been used by the two sides of the House. We can listen to the language of the Minister himself, rip-offs. And the moment that kind of language is used as the justification for a particular piece of legislation, it is clear that it's designed to summons all of the negative beliefs one has about welfare. Now, so I want to put on record, and a lot of people, I say to Mr. McIndoe, who are very wealthy and have been also defrauding the state for years, and some have been caught, many have not, and I don't see that member standing up and arguing against them. Now, the member doesn't, but the member and the member does not. The member is very clear. Mr. Speaker, I know that that member came into this Parliament for one sole reason, by his own admission, to fix up welfare fraud. That's in Hansard, that's in his speech, and that's a pathetic reason to be in Parliament. And if that's all that that member has to go by to be in this Parliament, the only contribution that that member wants to make to the vulnerable in New Zealand society, then I just hope that that member does get in touch with his own soul and his relationship with the most vulnerable. And I'm not so sure, Mr. McIndoe, that that member has done that yet. Coming back to the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, if the member wants to interject, I shall take him downtown as well. So I suggest he listens a bit, and I will. Well, figuratively speaking, of course, Mr. McIndoe. I've been with you downtown, but I wouldn't want to talk about that here. But everyone knows what I'm talking about. So, Mr. Speaker, when government members talk the language of rip-offs, they are conjuring up that negative impression of those on welfare. And the government has been doing for 5 long years. That's its raison d'etre. They're very quick to pull up all of the ladders that they had to get to where they are, but never to give it back to those who deserve it. And of course, there's any amount of jargon, any amount of spin that side of the House actually proposes to justify its position, Mr. Speaker, but none of it cuts any ice. In the end, these kinds of proposals are quite heartless. They're heartless because of the way in which they gain purchase for their argument. And the way in which they do that, Mr. Speaker, is to undermine a particular section of our society. And they undermine the poor and the vulnerable in this particular area. That's not to say, Mr. Speaker, that this side of the House condones, even for a minute, those who defraud the system. But this side of the House would want all of those who defraud the state to be beneficiaries of the same standards as the poor are. And they are not, Mr. Speaker, because what we do find that this government for 5 long years has perpetrated a whole series of legislation based on this notion of welfare dependency, which is their own creation, based on this notion of lifetime costs of welfare, which is their own creation, and then paradoxically the savings they make is based on that particular calculation. Well, nobody on this side of the House is duped by that rhetoric at all, Mr. Speaker. still saying very clearly those who abuse the state ought to be brought to justice. And whether this is the way of doing it, by first kind of conjuring up that image, Mr. Speaker, of the poor and the vulnerable, because this is who they are. I don't think anybody living in the middle class, in the upper class suburbs of our society are the targets here. The targets here are those who have got into a position by probably unfortunate circumstances where they have become dependent on somebody else who has taken advantage of them. And these are the people who are our beneficiaries. What the state ought to be doing is showing an exceptional understanding. Sorry, Mr. Speaker? Okay. What the state ought to, I thought it was giving me a signal. It's not, is it in order for the Speaker to give me a signal? I suppose it is, yes. I think he was agreeing with me by shaking his head from side to side. I am happy for the Speaker to support what I am saying. But it is the time, Mr. That's much better. It's time, Mr. Speaker. Wouldn't it be better, Mr. Speaker, rather, for us as a society to show a real understanding of those who are vulnerable, those who find themselves in a position, often bringing up children, who are dependent on the state for a period of time, to be extended the largesse of our great democratic society and the reasonably enormous wealth we have, to ensure that those children, those people get the best start in life and they make something of themselves, which is what the system is designed to do, designed by my ancestors, my forebearers rather, on this side of the House, and now being systematically, over the last 5.5 years or so, being demolished by that side of the House. And this is another example where they are trying to do that. But then still, Mr. Speaker, we will not tolerate those who defraud the system. There are many, many approaches, Mr. Speaker, for the state to be kind and generous, at the same time expect the standards that it deserves. This bill doesn't do that. In fact, the regulatory impact statement alludes to that. There are a number of ways in which those who get caught in this type of confused relationships and defrauding the state as well, that can be uncoupled, assisted, and regularized. And those who have taken money from the states, that to be recouped. There are much more humane and reasonable ways of doing that. The minister and that side of the House knows how, they know how to do that. But that does not give them the political purchase, Mr. Speaker, that they require for their own supporters, because their own supporters have been socialized into and now have internalized the language of welfare dependency and welfare fraud. So here this is not a huge sum of money that the Minister, Justice Burrows, is trying to recoup through this mechanism. But what will be its consequences? And those consequences have not been factored in. Mr. Speaker, I just want to talk about this one point. What is a person to do, say a woman with 2 children, to do when they're totally dependent on a benefit and they're at the stage of life where they get into relationships, they get into friendships, the friendships develop into relationships? And what if they make mistakes and somebody is taking advantage of their own status? Then how long are we as a state to allow them to have a space to have relationships that might be regularized and them becoming a conventional family, if you like? But what this bill does, it actually, in a sense, points the negative finger at those families, at those women in particular, I would imagine, who are trying to make something of themselves, require the largesse of the state, require the understanding, require an environment to be produced where the children will become good citizens, where they will get a good start in life. But no, Mr. Speaker, what we are trying to do in this bill is criminalizing those offenses. I mean, $5,000 fine and 12 months in jail for a mother with 2 kids who's made some bad decisions. That is the bottom line in this particular bill. And how can that be a reflection of our collective soul in this particular state? It isn't. So while we support this bill because of the message it gives about fraud, we do that with a heavy heart. We do that with enormous reservations. And we have not been able to convince the government to do much other than to make some provisions in this particular bill where at least MSD is required to consider all factors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.